or RAI, an acronym that some of you know very well. What do we mean when we talk about responsible or responsibility? It's an umbrella term that it covers many things, but the MRLG RAI workstream aims to counter the widely documented negative and exclusionary impacts of large-scale agricultural investments in the Mekong region, and sometimes small-scale ones as well. Everything okay with the sound? Right. So to counter that, we promote production models that are inclusive and improve outcomes and balance risk for farmers and investors alike. As we saw with Antoine and Quintetwe's poll, we have a big task. Smallholders are the largest constituency in the region and the backbone of rural economies. We all know the region has experienced very rapid agrarian change over the past decades, driven by policies promoting commercialization, export markets, and these changes have aimed to alleviate rural poverty, provide income opportunities, modernize production models, and so forth. And the transition has radically altered landscapes. It importantly has not been equally felt by everyone it aims to benefit. And many have welcomed the transition, but the environmental and human rights consequences have at times been severe. There's new high-resolution satellite data, about 1 meter resolution, that was released a few months ago by World Resources Institute and Google DeepMind that shows a really unprecedented detail in drivers of forest loss. And it shows, I was playing with the map a few weeks ago, but between 2001 and 2024, agriculture drove between 94 and 97% of forest loss in Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar. Obviously, there are other drivers, including mining and hydropower, infrastructure, and so forth. 50% of Vietnam's tree cover loss can be attributed to large or small-scale agriculture, but those of us who have worked in Vietnamese markets know that this has often come at the expense of forests elsewhere in the region and beyond, where Vietnam sources agri-food crops. And there are numerous examples where investment without critical protection for farmers' rights, from the large-scale concessions of the early 2000s to smaller-scale models such as contract farming, have resulted in landlessness, dispossession, and often with further adverse impacts to ecosystems as these communities are driven further into the forests. So if you're here from MRLG alliances, you likely belong to a customary tenure alliance or a responsible agricultural investment alliance, with the exception of Vietnam, where it's both. But I want to argue that both themes are really deeply interwoven, and I hope you'll hear this argument reinforced today, and I want to urge us to think of them as a holistic solution. So here's why. Recognition of customary tenure rights within statutory law is essential for communities and farmers that depend on agrarian resources for their livelihoods. It often gives farmers the investment confidence to make long-term decisions. In English, we say, no one washes a rental car. That's, you don't take care of something you know you might lose. And this holds true in many ways. Oftentimes, formalization and title, even though title does not automatically mean tenure, is a requirement to access finance. In Laos, for example, many loan instruments available to smallholder farmers require title as collateral, but that's not accessible if most farmers do not have title. Many of you went to the very excellent session yesterday on social integrity in carbon markets. This is an issue I've worked on a lot as well, and I've heard really overwhelming interest from our partners since I joined MRLG last year on learning more about carbon markets. Is this the investment opportunity we have been looking for? But their success hinges on tenure. So who owns the carbon? Who has the right to benefit from the market? How do these transactions work? How are benefit sharing mechanisms even decided? And finally, we recognize that many agrarian lands, particularly in the uplands of this region, the customary territories of ethnic minorities, indigenous people, and other local communities, are marked by legacies of past and current conflict, displacement, and migration. So in these contexts, agricultural expansion may, in fact, aggravate tenure insecurity and undermine efforts to peace. The movement of people also proves a quandary. So how do you prove customary rights when there has been movement of people on and off customary lands? I think of the pilots for recognition of tenure in state forest lands in Laos, in Koksabang village. This is a village where during the Second Indochina War and since, people have moved off their farming lands outside the village. Some come back, some do not. They're making decisions about where to produce food and other crops. But there's those of you who were in the Laos session yesterday afternoon heard a very lively debate about this. I also want to remind everyone, we tend to refer to millions of smallholders in very general terms, but smallholders are of course not a monolith. They're individuals within communities, often very savvy business people whose choices and behaviors day to day are complex and driven by cultural, environmental, economic, social, and political factors that extend well beyond their lands and their national borders. So there are consumption patterns and macroeconomic policies, trade policies set in Bangkok, in urban centers in the region, but also as far as Beijing and Brussels that are impacting the choices of smallholders in the Mekong today. So without further ado, I'd like to call up our panelists one by one. Each of them brings a very unique and vital perspective to this topic. We'll talk about some things that will be familiar to many of the MRLG partners and some that are not, so I hope this is a learning opportunity for you all. I'll introduce people. I didn't mean to introduce the women first, but I'm going to introduce the women first. First, we have Cécile Leroy from the EU Delegation to Lao PDR. Welcome, Cécile. Thank you for joining us. Cécile is the Cooperation Program Manager and since 2021 has been based in Laos, focused on green growth, natural resources, forestry and biodiversity, environment, circular economy, and climate change. So a very small job. She works closely with government partners, CSOs, private sector, and development partners. She spent more than 25 years in Southeast Asia with experience in Vietnam and Indonesia. Next, please welcome Esther Penunia. Esther is the Secretary General of the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development, or AFA, an alliance of 22 national farmers organizations in 16 countries, including Lao Farmers Association, which we just heard from. And they represent around 13 million women, men, and young farmers. AFA promotes sustainable, resilient, healthy, and just food system and empowers the agency of family farmers. Thirdly, we have Phuc Xuan. Phuc, please come up. Phuc is the Managing Director of the Forest Policy, Trade, and Finance Program at Forest Trends. He also is affiliated with the Crawford School of Public Policy at Australian National University and the Asian Institute, University of Toronto. His work focuses on forest risk commodities, particularly the evolution of legality and sustainability requirements in consumer markets and their impact on producer countries, particularly smallholders. And last but not least, we're very excited to have Tomi Haryadi from World Resources Institute, Indonesia. Tomi is the director of WRI Indonesia's Food, Land, and Water program. It's a large portfolio. He also aims to expand WRI's impact. He brings 20 years of expertise in climate change, agriculture, forestry, land use, air pollution, water, and food security, including 12 years spent here in Bangkok with UNEP and Recoff TC, where he led projects in social forestry. So he knows this region very well. You'll note that there's a QR code for submitting questions. We will do our best to get to your questions, but we also know that this panel has a lot to say. I'm going to ask questions in a couple of rounds, and the first round involves learning from regional successes. So I want to start with Tomi. Indonesia has dramatically reduced deforestation from oil palm in recent years, since 2017 or so. This is a success story that I think we can all learn from, especially given the country's parallel objective of growing smallholder-led rural economies and maintaining food security. The reasons for this success are quite nuanced. Can you explain to us what can be learned from the Indonesian experience and what led to this dramatic drop in deforestation?
Thank you very much, Naomi. Good morning, everyone. I think the two regions, the Indonesia, although it's the same Asian, Southeast Asian region, but it's a two typology of countries. But I see working with in the region for some times and also now back in Indonesia, I see similarities of the two regions. So particularly Indonesia have reduced, as Naomi mentioned, reduced deforestation significantly thanks to various of aspects, of course, Naomi. I think first because of the policy regulation on palm oil, knowing that palm oil is the greatest driver of deforestation, as we know, and palm oil is the largest commodity exporter. Indonesia is the largest palm oil exporters to the whole world. So palm oil is the driver of deforestation, that's for sure in terms of commodity side. And several things that what do you call it, influencing the success of deforestation. First, I think because of policy and regulation put in place by the countries in the last 10 years. Yeah. So one is actually the moratorium of the palm oil in 2018 by government of Indonesia, halting all opening a new land for palm oil, particularly in the forest areas. And then the second one, I think, is also the intention of government to give more power to communities to own land, to give them rights to manage and abstract forest resources. So land tenure is another thing that linked to that one. So since 2000, Jokowi's presidential, I think the government has been encouraging providing land tenure rights for communities through agrarian reform program. So that's the thing. So having communities strong in terms of tenurial rights and also having clear arrangement on land allocation, that gives less burden for government to manage forest resources, but at the same time also avoiding land conflicts. That's another thing. So in order to get to policy and regulations in place, what the first thing they do is the land use allocations analysis. Yeah. So there is a clear allocation for where the conservation area for forest and peatland has to be secured in not to be encroached by palm oil industries, and at the same time also encouraging companies and smallholders to be traceable through by getting the RSPO and also ISPO, the Indonesian version of palm oil certification. And another thing that very much important is encouraging communities, as I mentioned, to manage forest resources through programs such as social forestry and community forestry, which is very high at the priority of government. Yeah. So I think social forestry is part of the way Indonesia achieve the net zero emission from forestry sector by 2030. I think that's...
Thank you, Tomi. Indonesia is quite a different context, but also there are similarities. And one thing that I'm always struck by in Indonesia is the power of different sectors and multi-sectoral partnerships. The private sector issuing voluntary pledges for no deforestation, peat, and exploitation from palm oil. Civil society, a very active civil society, including indigenous and agrarian alliances, and the importance of government policy. So speaking of success stories and also the power of multi-sectoral partnerships, I want to ask Phuc from Vietnam. Vietnam has also had success in recent years in shifting away from illegal and unsustainable sourcing of timber and other commodities, both within its borders domestically, but also elsewhere in the Mekong and as far afield as Central Africa for hardwoods. Can you tell us about this shift and your unique cross-sectoral partnerships, namely the MOUs that you've established with trade associations and policy to make this happen?
Thank you, Naomi. Good morning, everyone. Vietnam has been engaging in some kinds of global agreements, focusing on timber, for example, voluntary partnership agreement with the EU. And Vietnam is implementing the very unique timber agreement with the US. And Vietnam has been actively engaging in EU compliant right now. It's a very interesting dynamics that how different levels of government also joining with private sectors in engaging in preparing the country for meeting requirements, the market requirements under BPA, under EU and also the US Vietnam Timber Agreement. And the dynamic is interesting in a way that the government themselves making efforts in bringing private sector into the mix, and also inviting development agencies in joining them, preparing the country for meeting the requirements. Now, the government always consider private sector is super important in terms of helping them, providing them with insights and using that insight to shape policy formulation. And of course, the private sector is the one implementing the policy on the ground by changing their practice, by adjusting their practice to meet requirements. We, Forest Friends, have been doing quite a lot of policy research, often in collaboration with trade associations and with the government agencies, because the private sector has a big role in shaping the policy in Vietnam. And through our collaboration with, we have a collaboration by way of MOU with Timber Association, Rubber Association, and Coffee Association. And we do a policy research together with the trade associations and using that insights in order to fit into policy making process, because in the government policy circle, there is always representative from private sector, and we on purpose using the government data, for example, import-export data, in order to form our policy insights, and using, again, that insight to share with the private sector trade associations, and then for them to share it with the government agencies. And we find it super interesting. Now we are now directly involving, being part of the government working group on EU DR, focusing on timber and also forest carbon. And so we have a space for using our insight policy research insights to form the policy. We also, in collaboration with government agency, creating different platforms that is a kind of open kind of virtual space, allowing participation not only from the government, not only from private sector, but also from civil society, joining us, sharing their insights, and using that insight to fit into technical working groups. So this is part of the government policy making process. I should stop there. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Phuc. Very inspiring work, as always. I want to turn to Esther now to reiterate once again the importance of recognition of customary rights and territorial rights in Indigenous and local communities. So tell us more why it is critical for communities to have a sense of security and their rights to land. I also want you to introduce us to the concept of agroecology, which we'll talk about throughout today. You've said when we spoke a few weeks ago that agroecology isn't just about production, it's about justice and power. Can you please expand on that?
Good morning to everyone. And Naomi, thank you for the questions, and thank you to MRLG for inviting us here in this panel. So first, on your question, I cannot add anything more to what has been discussed yesterday about the critical or the imperative of securing rights to lands for family farmers. 100% agree, especially it was emphasized by our colleague from Lao Farmers Association. We always say land is life. Land is our culture. Land is the basis for our dignity. But we do not stop at getting rights or ownership to the land. In the Philippines, we had agrarian reform since 1986. And you know what? Many farmers are now selling their lands, abandoning their lands. Why? Because agrarian reform does not stop on land distribution. Agrarian reform means land distribution plus support services in terms of providing financing for the inputs, the equipments of the farmers, providing support services and infrastructure like farm-to-market roads, schools, health centers, because family farmers are people. We need to maintain our health. We have children that will go to schools. And family farmers need technology, especially now with the severe impacts of climate. We need to innovate more. We need to research more. And especially because the current agriculture system that you said, Naomi, is still dominated by chemical-intensive monocropping farming. Where does agroecology come in? Agroecology, we believe, because in our experience, we see it in the fields of our members. Agroecology is key. And we have to transition from chemical monocropping to agroecology. What is agroecology? Maybe it's a new term for you, but in Asia, when we were starting our work in 2002, farmers were already saying sustainable agriculture, for a natural farming, a food forest, sustainable forest management, sustainable pasture management. These are all agroecological systems and practices. We do not start from zero. But why is it that it's not mainstream yet? No, after we have been promoting sustainable agriculture for the past 20 years, it is not mainstream yet. Why? Because the policies that our governments are enacting still support the monocropping, the chemical fertilizers. Our subsidies are in support, not of agroecology. So if we need to transition, we need to have first, of course, land rights, and second, an empowered farmers organization through our associations and cooperatives who will be the partners of governments, of development partners, donor agencies in mainstreaming agroecology. We have the knowledge from our ancestors, from our fathers, from our grandfathers on how agroecology can be done. We can research and innovate on our own farms. We can produce not only for production, but we can, through our cooperatives, we can have value addition and we can do processing and marketing and distribution of our products. That will increase our market power. We can increase our resilience because agroecology, integrated diversified farming, produces resiliency. I just remembered visiting our farm last week because we had a learning exchange on agroecology in the Philippines. One farmer who did integrated diversified farming. Another farm nearby who did not. There was a storm, landslide, and we see the other farm cut off because of landslide, but his farm remained intact. So this agroecology builds resiliency. And where is equity? We say knowledge is power. Current agriculture system builds and relies on the knowledge top-down with the agriculture companies, for example. But agroecology builds on the knowledge of the indigenous peoples, of the farmers, and of their ancestors. And with farmers' learning circles in agroecology, we can have that equity, we can have that power in transforming and in transitioning to a more sustainable and just system. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. That was incredible. I have nothing to add. So we're going to shift gears a little bit entirely to Cécile. We've heard about the EU DR, which Phuc mentioned. This is the EU Regulation on Deforestation-Free Products, which entered into force in 2023 and will be applied to large firms starting at the end of 2025. So, Cécile, what is the EU DR? Can you give us a little bit of background, what it is not, and why it is so transformative to have these demand-side, trade-based approaches?
Thank you, Naomi. So maybe before saying what it is, I will start with a bit of context. 11% of greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to deforestation or forest degradation. Sorry, okay. Shall I start again? No? Okay. In 30 years, 1990 to 2020, 420 million hectares of forest globally were lost. This is an area larger than the EU, and it's actually almost 90% of ASEAN region, to give you an amplitude of the phenomenon. And deforestation during these 30 years were very often legal and were very often triggered by agricultural expansion. And this is why the EU decided to look into its own consumption in order to minimize the consumption linked to deforestation and minimize imported deforestation. Because of this, the EU came up with the European Union Deforestation Regulation. It targets 7 commodities: timber, cocoa, coffee, rubber, cattle, palm oil, and soy. And the EU Deforestation Regulation requires that all these commodities, when they are placed on the EU market, need to be legal, need to be sustainable, and need to be covered by a due diligence statement that is issued by the operator placing the product on the EU market. What does that mean to have a commodity that is legal? That means that it has been produced in line with the law and regulation in force in the country of production. What does that mean? The commodity is sustainable. It means that it has not triggered deforestation or forest degradation after the 30th of December 2020. And why 2020? Because according to the UN Sustainable Development Goal 15, all countries agreed to halt deforestation after 2020. And finally, what is it? A due diligence statement. It's a statement that the operator putting the product, the commodity on the EU market will fill, where it states that there is minimum risk that the commodity has triggered deforestation. If risks were identified, mitigation measures were taken in the country. And finally, the due diligence statement also includes geolocation of the plot of land where the commodity were produced. So what it is not, the EUDR? EUDR is not a government-to-government agreement to certify product. No, it is not that. It is really putting the responsibility on the shoulder of the private sector operator. It is not a third-party certification scheme, even if third-party certification scheme can be used in order to document the due diligence statement. And so how it is transformative, maybe to conclude my intervention on this point, it is transformative because instead of, like before you mentioned the FLEG VPA, we were looking only at the tree inside the forest and the legality aspect. Now we are also looking at the threats outside of the forest, namely agricultural expansion. So the fact that the scope is much larger, much more comprehensive, is expected to lead for some additional result and impact on the ground. Law enforcement for this regulation is also clearly written in the EU Deforestation Regulation, meaning that the EU competent authority will proceed with checks at the border. So it's really important to have this law enforcement element. Beyond protecting forest, of course, it will also protect habitat and biodiversity. It promotes transparency, accountability of the supply chain and the good practice. And finally, it sets one way of addressing sustainability on the global market, and we hope it will influence the other big market worldwide.
Thank you, Cécile. Excellent answer. It's great to have your perspective. I note that there are 2 challenges in implementing the EUDR. Well, one is just the fact that it covers the 7 commodities that are most responsible for driving forest loss. It does not cover some very key commodities for this region, such as cassava and maize. The second is that although the burden of proof falls on operators in Europe importing, there is a risk that the need for further due diligence documentation excludes smallholder producers. So when we think about how to prepare for the EUDR in this region, that is top of mind. And we have a whole session at 11 about this question. But I want to turn back to Phuc. Coffee and rubber are very important to the Vietnamese economy and also listed on the EUDR. What have you observed working with these two sectors and with government to get ready for implementation? And can you particularly talk about the geolocation requirement and the creation of the maps?
Yes, so EUDR, as mentioned by Cécile, requires the information on geolocation, meaning the location where the commodity is produced. And also because of the deforestation-free requirements, supply chain actors have to make sure that they have a map of the showcasing the 31st of December 2020, proving that there is no forest on the land at that time or from that day afterwards. Now, preparing a map, Naomi mentioned about map, is super important. Now, the problem is that different agencies have a different source of information, and they have different kinds of maps. And which makes the supply chain actors very confusing about what maps that should be considered as reliable by EU. So the countries like Indonesia and I think you guys, Tomi has been talking about one map project, and Vietnamese government is also gathering steam in developing the idea of preparing one map for the country. And I think it's a super interesting dynamic there. Earlier, we had a different ministries, different government agencies responsible for land and forest, and they have a different kind of maps, and the maps do not correspond with each other. Now we have a map prepared by JRC, the agency assigned by EU for forest cover map. And so we have a Vietnamese organizations preparing different kinds of map, and there's a big gap in terms of showcasing the forest cover between the one prepared by JRC, the EU organization, not the EU, but the European Institute. What is that? Leroy Research Center, ARC, and the map prepared by, for example, Vietnam National University. The Vietnamese government decided that, okay, this is very confusing, and they would like to prepare one map following the Indonesia's effort. So the team is now gathering with the government, pulling together different local agencies in Vietnam with a different kinds of data, including, for example, formal Ministry of Environment, having a data on land, and the Ministry of the Department of Forestry having the data on forest cover. So they pull in an expert, a group of experts working on this with the idea that they would be able to come up with one map for the country, showcasing the forest cover, forest quality on the 30th of December 2020. Now, they would like to invite the EU into their preparation process by way of consulting with the EU that their method is viable enough for EU to be, later on they expect, I'm not sure whether it's happening, to recognize what they will be producing. So that they don't have to use, for example, supply chain actors do not have to use the JIC map, which is different from map. For example, JIC map so that the Vietnam forest cover is 70%, while the Vietnam existing forest cover is about 42%. So there's a huge difference there. So again, the idea of the Vietnamese government's effort in preparing one map is to produce one map for the country and using that for getting recognition from the EU. They hope that later on that, yes, the country's one map is reliable enough, and then EU could accept that kind of products when the supply chain actors use it to justify their legality and deforestation-free airspace. I should stop from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phuc. Really showcases the practical considerations that are needed to implement the EUDR. Cécile, similar question. Recently, there were 2 studies in Laos on EU DR readiness, one on legality and one on traceability. Can you summarize the findings of those studies, particularly the recommendations, and how they're being carried forward?
Okay, thank you. Very nice question. After Phuc intervention, actually, I will echo on some of your elements. But yeah, this study, the 2 study, legality requirement in Laos and traceability system existing in Laos were conducted in 2024. The findings are from the legality aspects that in general, Lao law are pretty clear, but the challenge is with providing the documentation because the documentation is often not available. So this is really something that we will need to work on collectively in order to improve the documentation of the value chains. On the traceability system, there are some sort of traceability system existing, more developed for coffee and timber than for cattle and rubber. It's always complex to have a full traceability system when you have a lot of smallholders. It's very often paper-based in Laos, while it would be nice to open for digitalization of the traceability system. And for what we have seen, there is no traceability system yet in place that can trace back the commodity to the plot of land where they have grown. Another important element of the study is about the forest definition. And you mentioned the difference in the map and the discrepancy and how we can maybe reconcile the different mapping we have. Because in Laos, for example, forests rely on a definition when you have 20% canopy cover, while the EU Deforestation Regulation uses the FAO definition and it's only 10% canopy cover. So indeed, the map that we have produced with the Joint Research Center of the EU show a very, very important forest all over Laos, while actually the land use in Laos is different because also there is a different map for the forest. So the recommendations are threefold. On the map and the definition, we encourage also a dialogue between the Lao Authority of the Ministry of Agriculture and Environment and the Joint Research Center. And actually, we are preparing for some technical assistance to facilitate this dialogue. The second recommendation is to accelerate the land reform implementation. We have been talking about it yesterday afternoon, but really land certificate, land use clarity, transparency is key in order to document the value chains in Laos and continue, of course, to engage with stakeholders in order to develop the capacity and the awareness of this. And maybe my last point, there are certainly very good experience from Vietnam and from Indonesia that could be brought and be inspirational for Laos to continue develop its national system. Thank you.
Thank you, Cécile. I'm going to go with 2 more questions, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for some of the questions that have been coming in on Slido. Great questions. I want to remind everybody there will be sessions on smallholders and ensuring that the burden does not fall on smallholders at 11. There's also going to be a session on agroecology. So please also keep in mind your questions about agroecology and smallholders for those sessions. Tomi, so looking to the future of Indonesia, vast country, world's largest democracy, one of the world's largest democracies, kind of.
I hope so.
I hope so, yeah. Indonesia's challenge is now to maintain its low deforestation rate, but the country is facing new pressures, these large food estates that are being announced, even breaking ground in some of the largest swaths of intact forest in places like Papua, and ongoing land conflicts, even as indigenous and Adat communities are documenting their lands following that landmark Constitutional Court decision from a decade ago. So what solutions do you recommend, and what is WRI doing to counter these challenges?
Thank you very much, Naomi, for the questions. I give a little bit background on these questions. Yeah, the current president, Prabowo Subianto, is very much ambitious in terms of its goal to increase Indonesia economic during the 5 years of his regime to at least achieve 8% of economic growth for the country, which is uncommon for Indonesia. And therefore, there are so many ambitious efforts, seems like really need further thoughts on how it will be implemented. So for instance, like in food and energy sovereignty, particularly on food sovereignty, where governments try to open at least 20 million hectares of areas, including forests. We're risking the opening of the forest in the next 5 years. So I think one most important, because still at the early stage of this policy, I think one most important thing that government has to do, and also along with all stakeholders, is to have a proper planning. So that's most important things. So such things like Phuc just mentioned about policies, regulations, ambitions need to be backed up with a good data, knowledge, and information that will give a fact-based decision-making process. Yeah. So one map is one of that thing. So having integrated maps to justify where things has to be done, what intervention has to be done, what commodities need to be selected for these food sovereignty programs, and where. That's another dimension that government and bringing all the stakeholders to work together on getting the right things to implement based on the facts, and also part of the information. What the biggest problem of Indonesia is data. So there are so many companies, smallholders working on various issues. Give an example, palm oil, but lack of information on data on who's doing what, how big is the land, what is the number of productions, etc. So this information is lacking, and particularly when we face EUDR, that's a huge challenge for the countries. So there is initiative for government to conduct smallholder registration, companies and smallholder registration through a platform named ESTDB, or also Siparibun, giving all requiring companies and smallholders to register their business, their locations. Geotech location is been trying to be introduced as well. So when such a regulation of UDR, for instance, coming, we have readiness to do that because we have information. And most importantly, besides the driving from the outside, the driving from inside, very important. When we know who's doing what at what level, then we can make a very much right decisions on that. So this ESTDB and Siparibun, the platform that the governments impose, particularly for certification, is the right thing to do. And then at WRI, we are supporting governments on providing the right information for food estate implementation program. For instance, we do the research in relation to land use, degraded land use allocation, and also degraded land allocation and land use allocation. But the reason is when government try to open 20 million hectares of land for food estate program, there are so many huge numbers of 60% of areas where we can utilize the degraded land, productive degraded land, and the second one is unutilized land that already belong to concessions, and also some areas where actually still can be cultivated in the degraded areas. Yeah. So the WI conducted such research to ensure where the right lands to allocate for these ambitions of 20 million hectares, but at the same time also planting the specific crops in the region, because the countries are so huge, and then there are commodities that can be planted in a very productive ways in some lands, but not in the other lands. And also some of the programs such as regionalization food, returning the original staple food of the region. For instance, in Papua and Sumatra, the staple food is different. People in Papua originally eat sagu and corn and maize and stuff, but then rice is actually coming from the western part. So I think bring back all the original food, and campaigning this actually a good way to stabilize the food program. Yeah.
Thank you, Tomi. That you touched on traditional food systems and crops, and that's a great segue into the final question we have for Esther, which is the theme of this forum is transformative change for people, land, and climate. So when you think about transformative change, what does that mean to you? And what's your vision for a shift in our agrarian and food systems from local solutions to demand-side approaches and everything in between that supports smallholder farmers?
Yes. Transformative change for us will be first, as much as 100% of family farmers will have secured tenure for their lands, waters, forests, and seeds. More and more farmers are shifting to agroecological approaches in farms, fisheries, and forest. More and more farmers are organized into local, subnational, national, and regional family farmers organizations, able to consolidate their voice for engagement with government and able to consolidate our resources so that we could have increased market power through value addition, processing, and marketing and distribution. Transformation for us means this organization of family farmers have a seat in the decision-making of government. Okay? Transformation for us will mean we are equal partners in the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, especially of climate finance projects and responsible agro-investments. Transformation for us will mean more direct access to climate financing, because right now in our research, only as small as 1.7% of climate finance goes directly to family farmers organizations. And we have an example with the IP 1.7 billion pledge, which says so very little has gone directly to IPs. Same as in family farmers. So transformation is this. And the key for us is for everyone to invest, to work with family farmers through our organizations and cooperatives, because this is our agency. Help us also to empower our agency so that we can scale up and we can scale out and further innovate our work on agroecology. Together, we can do this, but help us be and make us and incentivize us to be your equal partners in this kind of transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Esther. We're actually making good time, so I'm going to take some of the questions that have been coming in on Slido. Excellent questions, thank you all. A question for Tomi. Did international obligations/agreements/treaties play a role in the success of Indonesia?
Thank you, Naomi. Yes, actually, Indonesia's commitment, for instance, like first of all for EUDR, because it's contextual, right? So in the context of IUDR, EU is one of the big market for Indonesia, but not really the biggest one. I think everyone knows the biggest one is China. So I think at the beginning of EUDR, there was a big concern from companies not to comply with EUDR. They sent a very harsh letter to EU through the Association of Companies, saying that this is actually one of the European countries try to make countries like Indonesia poorer, so something like that, so very harsh. So, but at the same time, I think government through coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs try to see the glass half full, seeing that this implementation of UDR in the next coming months is something that for us a way to alleviate our palm oil production and also other crops, 7 crops, yeah, but for Indonesia, is palm oil is the biggest stakes, yeah. So for us to alleviate and upscale our palm oil production quality, and therefore there are internal, because this driver of UDR, there is one of the way that the government do is trying to prepare itself, Indonesia readiness for UDR by one of the things is, as I just mentioned, Super Ribbon introducing the platform for companies and smallholders to register their organizations. And then this actually one of the way rules can be help. At the same time, also Indonesia's commitment to NDC. Yeah. So having like a 39% emission target for NDC and 41 for with the help of others, boost Indonesia's confidence and commitment, ambitions to do this. So, for instance, like for forestry sectors, this 2030 follow netting, the forest and land use emission really drive Indonesia to be better, to where the forestry sectors can contribute to net zero emissions by 2030, and this is one of the way. This is one of the way that Indonesia is being, challenged and what do you call it, pushed to commit with this treaty and commitments. Yeah.
Thanks, Tomi, for that perspective. A question for Esther. How do you see the coexistence of large business and smallholder agroecology? One thing does not need to exclude the other. That's an opinion. Maybe you agree or not.
Yeah, I think there will be ways of working together, especially in providing economies of scale, in providing, for example, technical assistance, in terms of processing, in terms of aggregating the produce of the big and the small farmers. But first, let us empower first the organization of small-scale farmers so that we can level the playing field. Now, we could be equal partners. We cannot be dominated by one another. We could also find synergies with the large farmers at the global level in terms of the policy advocacy. In UNFCCC, for example, we are active in the farmers' constituency, and the farmers' constituency is convened by representatives of the World Farmers Organizations, and many of them are big farmers' organizations. But we find common denominator in terms of our policy work on climate action.
Thank you. A question that I want to ask to Phuc, but then other people can answer it as well. What policy measures can ensure that land-based investment benefits are shared equitably with local communities, particularly women and vulnerable groups? So think about this for Vietnam, and then maybe we'll pass.
I mean, if we look into rubber, coffee, and timber sector, smallholders are in Vietnam holding a lot of land. So, for example, 95% of coffee produced in Vietnam is by smallholder. About more than 50% of the rubber produced by smallholders in Vietnam, and 60% of timber produced by smallholders in Vietnam. What it means is that Vietnamese government has quite a good land policy distributing land to smallholders, and it's up for smallholders to use the land in the way that they want. I mean, market signal is the key there, right? Because smallholders are deciding whether they plant trees or they grow coffee or other crops is really dependent on market signal. Now, if we look, for example, into coffee sector in Vietnam, we have all big brands, global brands like Nestle, ZDs, and other brands that are in Vietnam, operational in Vietnam. They are largely depending on smallholders. Now, I think collaborating with smallholders is their business models backbone. The backbone. They have to collaborate with smallholders. The key question is that whether that kind of collaboration is a real and trusty or long-term relationship with benefits from market to be distributed equally, or to smallholders. Now, I think the government has been doing quite a lot of good stuff in looking into this, and particularly private sector coffee companies, and they understand that smallholders are super important for them. So they cannot have a case of I mean, some of them still, but most of them could not maintain the cut and run kind of mindset. They had to invest in smallholders. And I think in Vietnam, we are increasingly seeing the kind of quality collaboration between smallholders and private sector. What is needed more, I mean, going back to the EDR, here's the capacity of local smallholders in engaging in this kind of relationship. We could not expect that the private sector alone can be enough for smallholders in a way that helps them to secure their long-term benefits. I think the policy plays a big role, and I think the government is trying to do that, promoting the idea of better collaboration between the companies and smallholders. And of course, buyers in the export markets also play a big role as well in terms of investing in their sellers in the countries like Vietnam. And then the effort and incentive are expected to trickle down from producers to the smallholders. It will take time for sure. But I think I see the dynamic, it's interesting, and I see the political will, not only from the government, but also from private sectors. Yeah.
Thanks, Phuc. Absolutely agree. I like, and I'm going to take this quote with me, no one can afford to cut and run anymore. You need to invest in smallholders, and I think smart companies understand that. We're going to hear later today from a panel of investors who are, have really adopted their practices to be more responsible. And I think they would share that as well. I want to do the same question to Tomi, Cécile, and Esther. And remember, it's what key action or policy change would you recommend for equitable distribution of benefits from investment for smallholder farmers, particularly women and other vulnerable groups? It's hard to think of one, but can you try in about 30 seconds or 1 minute?
I think most important is a clear arrangement. That's one thing. Esther mentioned before about agrarian reform, not only providing asset clarity, giving land rights to communities, but also land access. In Indonesia, we call it as access arrangement, to give what to do after having rights of the tenure. So this actually by providing the right way of utilizing the land, allocations to marginalized group, women, youth, all people actually have rights to be better, and assistance. So this assistance cannot be done by government alone, but also the role of CSOs there to provide assistance and for government to engage with all stakeholders that can help them to secure this access arrangement strongly.
I want to point out that we asked about policy change, and you've talked about private sector, and you've talked about CSOs. So you're right, but let's. It's interesting when we talk about policy, we are not only talking about governments, and this is a multi-stakeholder alliance, so it's very fitting. Cécile and Esther, can you think of same question to you? One policy change, although feel free to talk about other actors as well in the policy sphere.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's important that we are clear on the different roles between indeed the government, the private sector, the CSO, the community. And to me, I mean, with the AUDR perspective, the role of the government is really to facilitate the arrangement and the life of the private sector and facilitate the work between private sector and a smallholder community. And it starts, and we are coming back to number one, by land tenure reform implementation and digitalization in order to ensure full, transparent information accessible for all and give the security to the smallholder. And then I agree with what you just said. You need also to continue to empower community, and this can be done partly by the government with enhance the capacity and the cooperative and so on, but there is also a place to a role to play by the private sector, probably also supported by a civil society organization to look at the right of the community and empower the community for negotiating good contract, win-win contract with private sector. Thank you.
Yes, for us, policies that really promote people-centered land governance. This means a set of policies that do agrarian reform and that helps facilitate the empowerment, organization and empowerment of family farmers around sustainable land use, plus policies that incentivize transitioning to agroecology, be it in terms of subsidies, technologies, having national agroecology plans like in Vietnam, or be it in providing technical assistance. These two should go together.
Thank you everyone for an excellent session. Just want to share a couple key takeaways before coffee break, before I turn it over to Solin and then coffee break. We've talked about the importance of partnerships, and a few examples. Phuc has talked about working with the trade associations. We've also had a plea for organization into farmers groups and cooperatives for market power and information. And speaking of information as power, we've heard a lot about the importance of data for evidence-based policies. A lot of this comes down to the small details in maps. Who's using which map? How can we clarify and coordinate our maps? But data is also quite political. So who decides which map to use? What is on the map? Who shares the map with whom? This is a very political decision, of course, and is not without risk. And so all maps should have input from civil society and communities as well. I think we can, when we talk about the agrarian transition, we tend to think about the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years, really since the mid-20th century. But we're now in this new agrarian transition in which there's no one dominant model. There's concessions, there's contract farming, there's many types of contract farming, there are cooperatives. And with these multiple models come multiple challenges, but also multiple solutions that we can learn from and share. So we have a pretty packed day. I encourage everyone to pick one session. It's hard because there are good ones. Pick one if you can, and really listen, network with each other, and focus on solutions. So thanks everyone. A big round of applause for our panelists, please. And back to Solin.
Thank you, Naomi, and the speaker for incredible insight. Please stand there for a panel photo. Friends, now we're coming up to the break, coffee break. We will not be coming back all together into this room after the break. There is a slight new thing I wanted to mention as you go to the coffee break. But first, most important thing, there are 3 coffee stations in different locations. You don't have to huddle in one corner. If you want to have coffee quickly, it's on the 2 other corners. You do have the coffee stations there too. After that, at 11 o'clock, from 11 to 12:30, we will go to 6 parallel sessions, as you can see on the screen. Please go there 5 minutes to 11 o'clock.